All right, this week we're talking about cognitive function, and more importantly, or more specifically, how can a concussion or some sort of head injury lead me into experiencing these cognitive issues, and is there anything that I can do about it? My name is Dr. Matthew Shem, and I'm the owner of Peak Brain Performance Centers located here in Colorado Springs. And the first thing I want to start off with is just defining what cognitive issues are. So in this article, they define it as they took different neurocognitive complaints that are typical after a concussion. And what they found was that attention and concentration were big ones. Cognitive processing, such as speed and efficiency. So maybe you feel foggy, like you have brain fog, or you just don't feel as sharp as you should. Learning and memory, working memory, executive function, and even verbal fluency. So maybe I know what I want to say, but I can't really articulate it well, or I just can't really get the words out that I want to say, right? And one of the common questions that I get in my office when people come and see me for whatever it may be, they come in with symptom X, Y, or Z, and they ask me, is this typical? Is this common? And it's hard for me to answer that. And I think this article here goes and explains it a little bit better as to why it may be hard for me particularly to answer that. So what this article did, or what this study did, is they took a group of collegiate football players, and after a concussion, they gave them a neurocognitive test. And what they found was that in most athletes, 5 to 7 days after they returned to their baseline. So they were basically good as new in 5 to 7 days. They felt fine. However, there was a 10%, or a little bit more than 10%, that still had these neurocognitive complaints post 7 days. So after 7 days after their injury, they were still struggling. And so it's hard for me to answer that question because that 10% that are still struggling, we don't know if it was they only struggled for 7 days, maybe 7 weeks, 7 months, 7 years. We don't know, right? And so that 10% of people are the people that make it into my office, right? The other 90%, if they're feeling fine, they're not going to come and see me because they feel fine, right? And so after concussion, the most often area of damage that I see is in the brainstem. And particularly if you think about how when you hit your head, your brainstem undergoes a lot of torque and torsion, especially. So if you think about it like a wet towel, if I wring out a wet towel, the center part of that towel gets wrung out the most. And the same thing kind of applies to the brainstem, and the fact when I hit my head, your brainstem goes under a lot of torsion, and this center part of your brainstem undergoes a lot of damage, particularly this area that houses something called the vestibular nuclei. And the vestibular nuclei is important because it basically takes in all this information to relay to the brain where we're at in space. So you have all three of these different systems that relay this information to the brain so that we know where we're at in space, because where we're at in space is the most fundamental question our brain is always asking. And the reason is, us as humans are designed to move. And if I have to move, or if I want to move, I have to know where I'm at in space first, right? Just like if I get in my car and I want to go somewhere, I put the destination in my GPS. And if my GPS doesn't know where I'm currently at, it can't make the appropriate plan to get me to the destination, right? So same thing with us as humans, is I have to know where I'm at so that I can coordinate movement and I can navigate through this world, right? So all three of these systems basically have to work in unison to relay enough information to the vestibular nuclei to then relay to the brain so we know where we're at in space. Just like if we're on a job site and you have all these employees or all these workers around you, all these people need to be doing their job and doing their job appropriately to contribute to the greater good of this project so the project gets done, right? Just like in the brain, all three of these systems have to be doing their job and doing their job appropriately so that we know where we're at in space and the brain is happy, right? Like I said before, the most fundamental question is where we're at in space, and the brain doesn't really care if it doesn't have all these secondary things, like maybe if I'm a little bit dizzy, maybe I have a headache, maybe I don't feel as sharp, my memory isn't spot on. All these different things are secondary to me knowing where I'm at in space. So here's a picture of the brain. And this is basically if you took your brain out of your skull and you chopped the front off of it and peeled it back and you looked at what was still left, right? So this outlined blue structure is your big brain, and that skinny pink area at the bottom is the brainstem. So whenever we talked about in the last slide, we talked about the vestibular nuclei and how it gets damaged. And the vestibular nuclei is located right at the bottom in the middle of that brainstem. And like we talked about in the beginning, all those neurocognitive complaints that you could be experiencing after a concussion, they come from the big brain upstairs, more specifically the frontal lobe in most cases, right? And so the question now becomes, how is it that I can injure my brainstem that lower pink area, how can I injure my brainstem during a concussion and somehow it's going to lead me to experiencing these neurocognitive symptoms that come from or originate from my brain, which is a different region of my brain, right? How can I damage this lower cortical area and somehow have symptoms that are coming from a higher area? And the example that I like to use is, like we talked about before, the most fundamental question that our brain is always asking, the most important thing to our brain is, where are we at in space? Just like as a parent, typically for most parents, the most important thing in their life is their child. And for most parents, they'll do anything for the betterment of their child, right? And so same thing applies to the brain, and the brain will basically do anything to figure out, where am I at in space? Like I said before, your brain doesn't care if you're a little bit dizzy, maybe you have a headache, maybe you don't feel as sharp. All these things are secondary to me first knowing, where am I at in space? So whenever you have a child, that child, from the time that they're born until they're a young adult and move out of your house, they're pretty much very reliant on you, right? And the fact that from that time, they're reliant on you for food, for water, for shelter, for clothes, for a place to lay their head at night, right? And with that comes a responsibility from you, because now if you're responsible for taking care of this child, you have less time in your day to do all the fun things that you want to do, and you have less money in your pocket because you got to tend to this child, right? And eventually, hopefully, for most parents, you would hope that one day this child's going to move out, they're going to get their own job, they're going to get their own house, and now they're not dependent on you anymore. So now you're an empty nester, and you have all the time in the day to do the things that you want to do, and you have all the money in your pocket to spend on the things that you want to spend it on, right? And that's the position that the brain and the brain stem should be on. So I think about this lower brainstem area, kind of like the child, and that big outline blue area, the brain, as the parent, right? And so all these structures should be doing their own tasks. So that child that has already moved out is the brainstem, and the fact that if the child is out on his own, he's living his own life, they're not dependent on you, they're getting their job done just like the brainstem should be doing. The brainstem should be doing its own job and doing these jobs appropriately, so that now the brain, you have more time in your day to do the things that you want to do, right? The brain doesn't have to worry about where I'm at in space, because it knows that the child is taking care of it, right? And what happens if, as an adult, this child has already moved out, right? And then they get in some life-threatening accident and they have to move back in with you. Now we're back in that position where they're dependent on you again. You now have less money in your pocket and less time in your day because you have to take care of this child again. And that's basically the position that we're put in when the brain gets injured or you have some sort of concussive event. And the fact that now, like we talked about before, as a parent, the most important thing to me is my child, and I have to make sure my child is okay and nurse them back to health and get them back out in the real world, right? And so same thing applies to the brain, and the fact that if the brain stem is not doing its job appropriately, the brain is going to say, well, I guess I got to stop sipping martinis on the beach, and I got to, take care of all these things that are lower. I have to make sure that I know where I'm at in space. And I don't care if I have to now deal with a little bit of dizziness, or I have to deal with a little bit of cognitive complaints, because first and foremost, I have to make sure that I know where I'm at in space, right? And so I think this is the most common mechanism behind why people who come and see me have cognitive complaints. And then typically what happens is if we get that brainstem region healthier and activate it with various different modalities, whether it be, vestibular input, maybe you need to work on their neck, maybe you need to work on their visual system, whatever it may be. And the fact that you get that system healthier is basically like nursing that kid again. You nurse that kid back to health and you send them back to their job and back to their own house, and now you're the empty nester again, right? So just like that situation, the brain nurses that lower brainstem area back to health. Maybe not be the correct way, but it's a good way to think about it. The fact that the brain now makes sure that I know where I'm at in space. It tries to nurse that brainstem region back to health. And then once that happens, once the brainstem is healthy again, now the brain has all the time in the day to do the things that it wants to do again, just like all the neurocognitive complaints that you had, they just kind of disappear. So that's probably one of the more common situations, but obviously there is certain instances, whether it be a stroke or some sort of head injury, where you can actually damage the brain itself. And that's going to lead us down a different route and a different video for a different day. So I hope that you were able to learn something in today's class. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or give my office a call. Follow me on Instagram and Facebook. Other than that, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one.